Welcome to the Bernie's Bootlegs podcast, where we explore the stories of successful musicians and share their perspectives on being an artist in a digital age. I'm your host, Kenny McCabe, and let's get into the show. Okay, first podcast of 2020 coming in hot. Happy New Year, everybody. In today's episode, we are speaking with saxophonist Steve Kortyka. We discussed his early musical history, working with Brian Newman, the impact of playing with musicians who are better than you, cruise ship gigs, why he moved to New York City, creative ways of building your network, why you should sometimes look at music like a job, the importance of practicing odd meters, and more. You can find Steve on his website at stevekortyka.com and also on Instagram at saxophonesteve. And so without further ado, I bring you my conversation with Steve Kortyka. Okay, guys, I'm here with Steve Kortyka. Steve, thank you so much for coming on the podcast.
Hey, man, my pleasure. Glad to be here.
Yeah, my pleasure. And so you are in Las Vegas right now.
Yes.
And you're out there with Brian Newman?
Yeah, we're doing a residency right now at the Nomad Hotel. We're staying at the Park MGM, and we've got it going for about a month. It's basically like 3 weeks, 5 shows a week. And then at the end of the week, on the last day of the show with Brian, we have a jazz and piano show with Lady Gaga right before that. So that ends up being a super long day, but it's great. It's super great to get to perform, and having people show up every night, pretty much packed house. It's really awesome.
Absolutely, man. And so can you tell us a little bit about the musical side of that gig, how you think about it, and I don't know, just how it came about?
Sure. I mean, it came about with Brian. I mean, I've known Brian since college. I'm 38 now. We've known each other since we were 18. And he, as long as I've known him, he's always been gigging. And he was gigging in high school when he was like 15. And then when I got to college, I met him at Cincinnati Conservatory of Music, and he was playing probably like 3 nights a week as a student in college, and just the nicest guy in the world as far as like sharing his musical experiences and giving people an opportunity to play. He would always invite me to sit in, and when I was that young, I felt like everything I played was not worthy of playing in front of other people, but he really encouraged me in a really positive way. So he just never stopped. He's been gigging that whole entire time. He moved to New York in around 2003 or 4, and then he met Lady Gaga in just like the underground scene. She was hanging out on the Lower East Side, and they ended up working at a couple of the same bars together, and just became really good friends before she ever blew up or became famous. And then it was just a lasting friendship, and there's a lot of stuff that's happened since then, but that's kind of like the short answer.
Yeah, man. So I'd love to rewind a little bit and talk about your early musical upbringing and your family and stuff like that, because I'm always fascinated by folks' origin stories, because it's just an interesting thing. Like, it's just especially in this day and age, it is increasingly uncommon or difficult, or whatever you want to say, to be interested in this kind of music and to be pursuing it. So if you think about it in a larger context, I mean, me and you as musicians, and a lot of folks that are listening to this as musicians, it's kind of the water we swim in. Like, we're around people hopefully all the time that have the same passion and drive for this art form as us. But if you think of it from the larger context, it's pretty crazy. Like, it's pretty unusual. So I'm always fascinated by how that came about.
Yeah, for sure. I don't think that anybody really gets involved in this for the fame and glory, or if they do, they start out doing it and then they quickly change professions. So for me, I started playing saxophone when I was 14, so that I could be in the marching band at my school. I went to an all-boys high school, and my brother had the genius idea of joining marching band because there were girls in the marching band. So he picked up the trombone and started playing, and I was like, well, I want to be in band because my brother's in band, and we got to hang out. And there's girls in band, so there's just a lot of social aspects to doing it. And I had no idea that I was going to love playing music as much as I did. So it kind of happened to me by accident. But I started out, just in the high school marching band, was playing saxophone, and I switched to trumpet the next year. and still kept playing saxophone. But it was just practicing a lot, doing mostly, actually, just entirely classical music. I was just obsessed with like becoming an orchestral trumpet player while I was in high school, and I would still do saxophone. Also, I would do like a lot of the classical stuff. So when it was time to apply to college and all that business, I realized that I was gonna have to figure out how to get some scholarship money, and also have to get accepted into college. So just to backtrack a little bit, my parents had really no musical upbringing whatsoever. My dad actually did play and sing in church. He played guitar and played a little bit of piano, but he kind of quit doing all that stuff when he reached the age of 12. So he can still sit down at an instrument and play, but he sounds like a 12-year-old kid when he plays. And recently, actually, in the last like 10 years, I think started practicing piano again, which is great. I think it's great for his brain and mental health and all that stuff. Anyway, so like going to college, I remember very vividly the moment when I was like, jazz is what I want to do. And I signed up for a combo it was at Ohio State University, actually. I ended up transferring after the first year. And there were these kids, we played Eternal Triangle. Gene Walker was my combo director, amazing saxophonist, and he was the professor at the time. And there was 3 tenor players in the combo. It was just like one of those like mega combos with way too many horn players. And we were just playing like all the hits basically. And we played Eternal Triangle, and I remember they counted off, and I was looking at the BPM of it, and it's like 300. Like I had never seen anything like that, like in classical music or anything. Like 300 is just insane. And we counted off, pretty close to that. And the tenor players stood up, and one of the guys was from Buffalo. Another one was a Columbus person, but he studied with Gene in high school. And these guys were just like blazing over rhythm changes. And to me, to hear that, and knowing that these guys were improvising, they're my age, and just completely like, it just blew my mind at the moment. And then, from then on, it kind of changed my whole perspective and just me as a person, because I went from thinking I'm this amazing musician and know everything to realizing that I don't know anything, and literally like as long as it took us to play that tune. So that was what got me hooked, is just like the realization that I had so much to learn, I still have so much to learn, and that it's only going to make me a better person and more patient person and more disciplined. So I kind of just really got drawn to that aspect of it and never really looked back since then. I've always just really loved practicing and really loved the digging in, discovery.
Yeah, man, I always love those types of experiences where you get to kind of reach the edge of a cliff and look over the edge, and you get to see exactly what you don't know, because you can definitely be swimming in a certain water and just in your comfort zone, I suppose. And so it's always a never-ending process, and it turns out, at least in my experience, that the more you learn, the more you know that you don't know.
Absolutely. Yeah.
So tell us a little bit about how the move to New York came about, because that is obviously a very difficult thing to do. New York is a crazy place, as they say, and I've said a few times on the podcast, like, you don't live in New York, you survive in New York, as folks in the past have said. And so what made you decide to set your sights on New York, and what was the actual experience like on a practical level of moving there?
Yeah, well, this is a great question. A lot of me moving to New York was just centered around the fact that I was a jazz musician, and I really loved it so much. When I got out of college in 2004, kind of just like floated around Cincinnati for a little while. I was teaching private lessons, maybe had like 16 to 20 students that I was teaching. And I was getting by, like paying rent and living with my brother at the time, but something just didn't feel right. Like I knew I didn't want to be a private lessons teacher for my whole life. And Brian Newman had moved to New York that year. And I was just, I wasn't able to play with him anymore. Didn't have a ton of gigs. So at that point, I had discovered cruise ships. One of the guys that went to Ohio State had just came back, and he was hanging out at there's this club called the Greenwich, and I was like, man, he was a great player. His name's Josh Atkins, and he's a dentist now. But I heard him play at the Greenwich Jam session, and he sounded amazing. I was like, man, where the hell have you been? Like, where did you come from? How come I haven't heard of you? And he was like, oh, I just got off cruise ships. I've been doing that for like a couple of years. So I basically got a reference from him to join cruise ships, and I got slated on a really nice ship. So I ended up doing that for a little while. Did that for about 4 years, and once that ran its course, the same kind of thing. I got off ships, and I was like kind of just floating around for a year and trying to figure out what to do. And I realized, like most of my friends either had kids or were starting a family, or they were headed down like some other career path. They weren't deciding to be musicians anymore. So I just took a gigantic leap of faith. I had about $10,000 that I had saved up from ships, and I moved to New York. I found an apartment, like a room in a really small house. It's pretty well known, or it was for about 10 years, a jazz house in Astoria. I lived there for, I think, 4 years. When I first moved in, I was in basically a room the size of a closet. I was paying about $500 a month in rent, which was perfect because I wasn't getting stressed out about the amount of expenses I had. But I did burn through the money that I had saved pretty quickly. So the first 2 years I was in New York, there wasn't a lot of reasons to live there. But I was growing just leaps and bounds musically. I went to the park a lot and played. I was playing sometimes like 6-hour days in the park. There's actually one of my favorite videos of myself that I was going to try and get you to put on Bernie's Bootlegs if possible. There's one day we played in the park, and it's like right at the end somebody came and they had like a high def camera, and this is like 2011. After 6 hours of playing, so like I would just like everything was literally like from mind to sound. I was just there because I had the horn in my hand so much that day, and I don't really get there very often, so like to have that have been captured video-wise was really special. But yeah, I just decided to move to New York just because I was like, oh man, I want to be around the best players. I want to do whatever it takes to work. And the first 2 years were super rough, but things definitely picked up a lot quicker than I would have expected. I guess I didn't know I didn't have this idea that I was just going to perform with Brian, like moving there right away. But things picked up for him very quickly, and I did whatever it took. I looked at it like a full-time job, and put in at least 8 to 12 hours in becoming a better musician, and being the type of person that people are going to want to call. So I ended up making a ton of connections. I remember one thing too I did that I think was important. I think everybody should do is I made a list of everybody I knew that lived in New York, and kind of checked on what they were doing and made just like a contact list. And I texted all of them. It was probably like 25 people that I knew. Since I didn't go to a New York school, I didn't have like this already kind of network set up. But I also didn't have an insane amount of student loan debt or college debt too. So it was a good trade-off. But yeah, that was part of that process for sure.
Yeah, I'd love to talk a little bit more about that, but I just want to rewind for a second and discuss the cruise ship thing for a hot minute, because I don't think it's come up on the podcast yet. And it's definitely one option out there for being able to work and make a decent amount of money as a musician with most of the time, not a ton of experience in that kind of thing. And so I would love for you to maybe tell us a little bit about what you found the positive and negative aspects of working on a cruise ship in that type of environment, how you thought about that.
Yeah, there's definitely both, positive and negative. I think it has a lot to do with where you get placed and what ship you're on. There, like with anything, there's good neighborhoods to live in, good bad neighborhoods. There's like socially, you can get involved with cool people, or people that are going to bring you down, or people that are going to lift you up. It's the same thing with ships. Like if you get put on a bad ship, it's going to be a pretty horrible experience. And if you could put on a good ship, you're going to be around a lot of really cool people, and it's going to be great. And the thing I really loved about ships for me was that I was just around so many different cultures. I came from like Midwest Ohio, and then I jumped into this thing where there was just like so many different people around me all the time. So I was learning about that, and I was also just learning about music that is popular music that people want to hear. It's just needs to be good music. Otherwise, your function as a band on a ship is pretty much not there. So I think if you get like I know I keep going back to this, but if you get put on a good ship, it's really like there's no better way to earn money right out of college and be moving in a musical direction that is going to be beneficial for you in the future. Like I was able to practice, learn tunes, learn pop music, learn just everything that you need to know, So I really didn't have a bad time. I think there was maybe like one contract I did where I was on a quote unquote bad ship. And, I just did my time and then got onto a good one after that. But yeah, I don't know if any other questions about that. I'm totally open to talk about. I definitely have a lot of friends that had horrible experiences on ships. And I think it was just that, they got placed in to fill in a gap, or, they needed somebody for a particular ship in a kind of an emergency situation or whatever. But a lot of my friends only did one contract, and because it didn't go so well, they never did it again. But
yeah, if you were talking to a younger musician who is about that age that you were when you started to, work a little bit on cruise ships, how would you advise them? What kind of questions would you ask to gauge whether or not they should or would enjoy that type of experience, or who would you recommend it to?
Yeah, I mean, I think the biggest issue that people have is just that you're basically living in a dorm room again. And if you're sick of that lifestyle, or it wasn't something that you were a huge fan of, not that anybody's a fan of that, but then I would say that's the biggest issue. It's like you live in a very small quarters. It's actually like half the size of a dorm room, and you're bunking with sometimes a 50-year-old man. So if that's going to be a problem, then don't do it. But everything else, I would say, if you want to be a musician and you want to get paid to learn about your craft and to hone your craft, then you should do it by all means. But if you're claustrophobic or you're not able to get along with people, then steer clear.
Yeah, and I'm pretty sure there's something to be said about the variety of music that you are most likely going to be able to play, because I've never done a cruise ship gig, but from what I understand about them, you're not playing straight ahead jazz all the time. You might be doing some of it, but a lot of it is going to be pop music, like you're saying, and that can be a good place to be able to build that skill set if that's something that you think would be valuable to you later on.
Yeah, I mean, that's another great point. And a lot of people, coming out of like a really great school like Manhattan School or Juilliard or any of those schools, you're surrounded by these just stellar musicians, incredible, and then to be thrown in a cruise ship environment can be a huge buzzkill for sure. And I totally get that. Luckily for me, that wasn't necessarily the case, so it didn't bother me as much. I didn't feel like I was like having my education numbed in any way. And I kind of just stuck to myself, and I steered clear of a lot of the caveats that people can run into as far as like the darkness of it. I will say too, like 10 years ago, or 15 years ago now, wow, when I was doing it, they had jazz trios, and jazz was, I think, a lot more prominent of a fixture. At least definitely was on Carnival, and it was on Princess, which I did later. I don't know if that's the case anymore, but there usually was some kind of jazz element, which is what I focused on. Some of the production shows, and it's the same thing with the ships. If you get on a good ship, you don't have to play a ton of production shows, which is all pop music, and it's just like review shows. I will say it's cool to learn those tunes, but if you're playing a show for 6 months and you're playing it, 4 times a week, I guess, whatever, a certain amount of times a week, it can, really start to, I hate to say it, it's such an ugly word, but it can start to like rot your mind a little bit. But yeah, I don't know.
Yeah, it's definitely an interesting topic, and I mean, it can only, worst case scenario, you get put on a ship with people that you don't really like, playing music you don't really like, but even if that is the case, I mean, you're still learning stuff. You're learning how to be professional. You're learning how to show up to things on time and kind of how to, still make the most out of a situation, because obviously not every musical situation you have in your life is going to be ideal, and so it's important to learn how to be able to deal with that and not just break down the first time that you get put on a gig with someone that's not your favorite person, or playing music that is not the type of music that you would hear on Smalls on a Friday night.
Yeah. Yeah, very true.
So I'd love to go back to New York and all that. I thought that was really interesting that you said that you made a list. You literally made a list of everyone that you knew in New York at the time, and made a point of at least reaching out to them, keeping up with what they were doing. And so one of the things that comes up a lot on the podcast is this concept of networking and building your network. And in a sense, what you're talking about is kind of building your network, but it's not, I would imagine, trying to build your network in the way where you're trying to leverage your relationships with other people specifically for boosting your own career. It's kind of just, to be able to make genuine connections with people and be able to more or less be people's friends, because people want to hire their friends, obviously, and so on and so forth. And so I'd love for you to maybe elaborate a little bit on what your thinking was behind doing that, and if you continued to do that into the future.
Yeah, it's always centered around how busy I am at the time, and luckily, like for the last 3 or 4 years, Brian Newman has kept us like pretty gainfully employed playing wise, so I haven't really had to reach out a ton. But anytime if I have like kind of a lull or a period where I'm not playing gigs, I will definitely go to my friends' gigs, connect with them, and try and set up a session with them, and just get to play with them and pick their brain about what kind of music they're working on, or bring some of my originals and play through them. And that in the past has almost 100% led to getting some kind of gig with those people. Like whether it's a function gig or like a restaurant gig or something, they'll almost always end up calling me for something, because I made the time to reach out to them. I don't know exactly why. Maybe I'm just lucky with that stuff. I mean, part of it is connections, and that I do gig regularly, so maybe people want to just get on the sub list for that gig, which I try and make happen if in any situation that I can, just to return the favor. But I will say, there's a surprising amount of people that just don't do that for whatever reason, or they could do it more and they don't. But I've always just been super. When I do have like free time, I'll definitely try and just hang out with other people, or just really focus on my career and try and get my own gigs that way. So I don't know if that answers the question. I kind of forgot what the question was last one, but
that's okay.
Sorry about that.
Yeah, man. I'd love to get a little bit specific about practicing in the saxophone as well. So the period of time that I seem to be most fascinated by in people's careers, especially people who move to New York, is that first 2 to 5 years where, especially if you have not already been living there, to go to school can be a very pivotal year in your development. And a lot of people, I mean, probably the majority of people, are going to either stay or leave within those first like 2 to 5 years. And so I'd love for you to tell us a little bit about what kind of stuff musically you were working on at the time, and just what you were practicing, because I'm sure you're probably thinking about improving your musicianship at the same time as trying to work on your career.
Yeah, absolutely. I definitely was practicing a ton. I mean, I got some day jobs and stuff when I was there. At least do like 3 to 4 hours. And I've watched some of your other podcasts. A lot of these guys are saying they practiced, like 3 or 4 hours. Like when I was in college, I was practicing like 7 to 8 hours every day, like just insane amounts. I remember like I was really scared that I thought I was going to lose one of my permanent teeth, because I was practicing a lot of classical music in college, but I was using them so much and putting so much pressure on the mouthpiece that I felt like a crack in one of my like nerves or whatever in my teeth. So I ended up having to change my armature because of that. But I've always been like a crazy practicer. So when I moved to New York, that was no exception. That didn't change at all. I ended up working on odd meters a lot, and we were talking about that before. But before the podcast, odd meters has always been like kind of an obsession of mine because I realized, one, I was horrible at it, and two, I noticed that when I would go back to playing in four, I would just have so much freedom. So I was playing sessions with people, and almost every time I did it, there was like an odd meter would come up, or something that just really kicked my butt. So I just made a folder of everything that was destroying me, basically, and I made a folder, and then I would start to tape it to the wall in the room that I lived in. I basically just had a bed and a piano and just a bunch of charts on the wall, and I was just working on everything that I couldn't do. Basically everything that would come up. If I heard a tune at a session, I would go and learn it. And yeah, just trying to really explore specifically rhythm, but also just learning tunes and coming across things that I couldn't do and trying to figure them out.
Yeah, man. So after those first couple years in New York, where you were, presumably kind of scuffling, just trying to make things happen for yourself. After that period, what did living in New York look like for you? What types of gigs were you playing? Was it primarily like the Brian Newman thing that allowed you to be mostly or to be self-sufficient? Can you just tell us basically what the next step was for you?
Yeah, totally. I was always trying to figure out basically just how to break even so that I wasn't spending more than I was making. And I think I finally got to that point maybe by the end of the second year I was there. I kind of had burned through my savings, and then I remember at the end of like 2012 I had like $1,000 in my bank account, and that was it. And I started with 10,000, 2 years before. But yeah, things just took a shift. I was catering, and I was working with Brian one day a week back then. I think it was Thursdays. We were playing at the Rose Bar, and I had this job. I tricked this financial investor into letting me be his intern, even though I was like 32, and that was paying me like a salary job. So when I was there, I would do arrangements and stuff. That Brian had started doing like small group stuff, like 10-piece, and I would just basically just get paid to arrange while I'm at this intern job where this guy didn't really know I was even there for the most part, which is super sneaky. But that was when I realized like, oh, I'm actually, I'm finally breaking even, and this is starting to work out. I can kind of like tell my parents I'm doing something that they would be like remotely proud of. I obviously didn't mention the part of like tricking somebody into paying me, but that went on for about like 6 months or whatever, and then Brian started getting more gigs and more things just started opening up, and I also got into because of Chad Lefkowitz Brown, which I want to mention him. He's obviously phenomenal. Every saxophone player knows who he is. One of the first people I subbed a gig out to was Chad, and I subbed him Brian's gig, and actually this singer that we both knew, her name's Devin Rush, really lovely singer. I subbed him that gig too, but I was always like, that was another thing about networking and connections, is I was always like trying to be around the great players and be friends with the great players, because that was who I wanted to be. And I think by doing that led, for me, it led to a lot of connections that he had, and he ended up getting me involved. I don't know if you've heard of the Silver Arrow Band.
Sure.
They might be called. Yeah, so he got me into that like in the end of 2013 or beginning of 2014. And that band, I mean, they work a lot if you're in with them, and I think it's a brilliant design, the way that they've set up that company. So that also came about like around the end of 2013. So I started doing just a bunch of wedding gigs. So by that point, that was when I I think the despair years were kind of over.
Yeah, man, Silver Arrow Band. I think this Silver Arrow Band, I think it came up actually in podcast episode number 1 with Benny Benak, because I think he got in. Yeah, he got in pretty early too, and it's kind of crazy. If you live outside of the New York tri-state area, you probably don't know, but if you are anywhere within several hundred miles of New York, then probably you know a musician who is in like the Silver Arrow roster, as it were. I don't even know how many hundreds of people that they have in there now, but yeah, so that's super interesting. And so maybe you can tell us a little bit about anything that you've had an opportunity to do that's been major kind of under your own name, and anything that you have going on as of late.
Sure. I guess just as a leader, I unfortunately don't, for whatever reason, I don't really get to do it as much as I'd like. I haven't really headlined any like major clubs. I've gotten to do a lot of really cool stuff, I think, as a sideman. Obviously with Brian, there's been some huge profile stuff that we've done with him. We got to tour with Tony Bennett and Lady Gaga when they did a tour in 2015 of Europe and the States. And that was like 2 months solid. It was basically like a gig every other day. And we would just, travel to the next city or venue. And I also play in this band with this Canadian pianist, John Stetch. And he's able to travel, like every 6 months or every year. We get to tour Canada for a week or two, and that's really great to dig into his original music. And these projects both have inspired me. Like I co-lead this group called the New Alchemy Jazz Orchestra with 3 arranger, trumpet players, and myself. The Gaga stuff kind of inspired me to just get my arranging stuff together and just really learn about that and really dig into that, and just know, how to write good sounding arrangements and get creative with them. And then I would say the John Stetch stuff, he's really into odd time signatures, and that's inspired me to write my own music that has some of those elements in it and just write more creative music. And then working with Brian, he's kind of, in the last like 2 years, he's really started to realize, he can sing any song he wants to sing. So we've been taking, in this last run, we started doing like The Gambler, some more current songs. Where he really likes to take country songs and then turn them into so a lot of times it ends up working as a funk, like a 2-beat country can cross over really well as a funk tune. So while these aren't, I'm a sideman in these situations, I still feel like I'm able to bring a lot to the table creatively. So I'm fueled in those departments. And then I do lead a group. I just recorded a bunch of stuff at the end of 2018, and I'm finally getting around to releasing those videos. But I did a whole album of just tunes that I wrote, and 1 or 2 originals of some of the other guys in the band. So I'm looking forward to getting all that stuff out there. But yeah, there's just a lot, coming up that I'm super excited about. I can't really think of all of it right now. But sorry, I'm horrible at answering some of these questions sometimes. I'm sorry, I get scatterbrained. Nobody ever asked me about myself.
No, man, it's all good. And so those videos of your recordings, are those on YouTube?
They're going to be. I'm actually going to do another one tomorrow. But there's the first 2 that I've released. They're up on YouTube under my account. Yeah.
Sweet. So people can definitely go check that out and subscribe to your YouTube channel and all that. And then also, obviously, the link to your website and other socials will be in the show notes if people want to follow you and keep up with what you're doing. So my final question, and I've been asking this to a lot of folks, and I'm always curious of the response, which is, what is your biggest advice or things that a young musician should think about if they want to do the same kind of thing that you're doing? A lot of different sideman projects, a lot of just in a lot of contexts, and maybe things that aren't even necessarily specific to saxophone, but maybe can apply to a wider range of instruments. How would you advise someone who's in high school or college that sees what you're doing and they're just like, hey, that's pretty cool, like I would want to do something like that?
Yeah, wow. That's a great question, and it can have a lot of different answers, but I'm going to go with like the broadest sense answer that I can give it, and that's just to make sure that you really love doing it, because if it has to be kind of like an irreplaceable part of your life or your existence, and like really examine the reasons why you want to do it. But if you know that it's something that's super important to you, then your love for it will carry on to other people. But if you if I've seen musicians and they get older and they get jaded and they get super dark, and it kind of always makes me wonder why they got into it in the first place. I mean, a lot of I guess when I say examine the reasons why you're doing it, like you should be wanting to inspire other people, or just kind of uplift in some way, obviously to emote, but just really make sure that you're in it for the right reasons, and for a positive reason. But there's definitely, I just copy, find the people that you are inspired by and kind of do exactly what they're doing, and then you're obviously, as a self-minded individual, are going to have your own spin on that, and it'll always be something different. So
yeah, man, well said, Steve. This is awesome. I really appreciate you coming on today.
Man, thanks so much for having me. Much appreciated.
My pleasure, man. Stay on the line for 1 second, and thank you again.
Cool. Thank you.
Thank you so much for checking out the podcast. Don't forget to subscribe wherever you happen to be listening to this. And if you enjoyed the podcast, consider giving it a 5-star rating on Apple Podcasts or your favorite podcast app. For more episodes, please visit berniesbootlegs.com. Thanks again, and see you guys next time.